All right, so let's dive into this deep dive. It's all about safety at sports grounds. Now, I know you're already pretty familiar with this stuff.
Yep.
You sent over this document. It's called the Guide to Safety at Sports Grounds, and it's a pretty hefty document.
It's the Bible.
It is, yeah.
If you're involved in this kind of event planning or management.
Yeah, and it was put together by a bunch of experts to kind of set the standard, make sure best practices are being followed and make sure everyone's on the same page when it comes to keeping crowds safe. And I gotta say, going through this thing, it's like, whoa.
Yeah.
I mean, even I was kind of surprised by how much goes into it.
It's one of those things, when you're at a match or a concert or something, you don't think about it.
Right.
You get caught up in the excitement.
Yeah.
But behind the scenes, there's a whole system,
Yeah.
a network, working to make sure things run smoothly and safely.
Exactly. And, the guide gets right to it.
Yeah.
I mean, right off the bat, it's like, boom. Huge responsibility on the shoulders of the ground management.
Yeah.
They're accountable for everyone. Spectators, staff, vendors, anyone who's even setting foot on the grounds during the event.
And that's not something they can just delegate,
Right.
Outsource it. Like,
Oh,
oh,
no.
we've hired a security company, so we're good.
Right, exactly.
No, the accountability remains with the ground management.
They're ultimately responsible, right?
Yeah.
And they need to really get it. They need
Yeah.
to understand the physical condition of the venue, the safety management procedures, all of it.
Yeah. And that's where these P&S factors come in.
Yeah, the P&S factors. So let's break those down a little bit because these are kind of how they measure and quantify these risks, right?
Right. So the P factor is focused on those physical conditions.
Right.
Think about the structure, the seating, barriers, anything that could be a risk if it's not up to par.
Right. And here's a crazy detail. If there's like a section of the venue, let's say it's in terrible shape, right? They can hit it with a P factor of 0.
That's right. Basically saying
It's unsafe.
this area is unsafe,
0 capacity.
can't hold anybody.
Yeah.
And it's not just theoretical either.
Oh, yeah.
Back in 2017, there was a football stadium in the UK.
Oh, wow.
They had to apply that P factor of 0 to a section of the stand, and it caused a lot of disruption
I bet.
because they had to reduce the capacity, but ultimately safety over profit.
Absolutely. Yeah. So then you've got the S factor. This is about the safety management, right?
Yeah, more the human element. How well
Mhm.
trained is the staff?
Right.
Do they have communication systems? Are there emergency plans, up to date?
Right. So it's about having those systems and making sure people are ready.
Yeah, and a good example of that is the steward training programs.
Yeah. And I've heard that some venues are even using virtual reality
Oh, yeah?
for this to like simulate different scenarios.
Yeah, like crowd surges,
Wow.
medical emergencies.
So they can actually kind of experience those things.
Exactly. Prepare for them.
Wow. That's really cool. Okay, so you've got your P&S all figured out. You've got your staff trained, you're good to go, but then you've got all these people, right?
Right, thousands of them.
Moving through the venue, that's a whole other challenge.
Yeah, crowd flow is a huge part of it.
Absolutely.
And the guy breaks it down into these zones, zone 1, 2, and 3, plus zone X, which is outside the venue.
So it's almost like a city planning kind of approach.
Exactly. You're thinking about how people enter, how they exit,
Right.
how they move between areas.
Right, the bottlenecks.
Exactly. And for new venues, ideally you want continuous circulation routes.
So that means you can kind of walk all the way around.
All the way around, no dead ends.
Makes sense. But what about older venues?
Yeah, the ones that weren't designed with that in mind.
Right.
Well, that's where crowd simulation modeling comes in again.
Ah,
So
yeah.
they can run these virtual tests, almost like a video game,
Oh, wow.
to see how crowds behave in different scenarios.
It's like predicting the future of foot traffic.
Exactly.
That's really cool. So now you've got people moving, but you've got to get them in their seats.
Right.
And that's where ticketing strategy comes in.
Yeah, which is more complex than people think.
I never thought about that, but yeah, I guess it is.
You've got your reserved seating where everyone has their assigned spot,
Right.
and then you've got unreserved general admission where it's kind of a free-for-all.
So you're saying the venue can actually influence how the crowd moves just by how they sell tickets
Absolutely. For instance, they might do discounted early bird tickets
to get people to come early.
to spread out that influx of people.
Right.
Or they could even partner with public transport, offer integrated tickets,
So people aren't driving.
encourage people to use public transport.
That's pretty clever.
Ah.
All right, let's shift gears for a second and talk about something that unfortunately is a big concern these days, and that's security and counterterrorism.
Yeah, the guide's very clear that security is a subset of safety, but it's essential. And it's not just about preventing incidents, it's about having those plans in place to respond effectively if something does happen.
Right. And they talk a lot about searching and screening procedures, which I think is pretty standard.
Yeah.
But what really stood out to me was how the efficiency of those procedures can actually impact safety.
Yeah, Figure 7 in the guide breaks it down really well.
Oh, okay.
It shows how different methods like bag searches, pat-downs can drastically impact the entry rates.
Right.
So you've got this balancing act between being thorough and avoiding those massive bottlenecks.
Because the bottlenecks themselves become a hazard.
Exactly.
Yeah, if people are all crammed together outside, that's not good. Okay, let's move on to something a bit less intense. Demountable structures.
Yeah, these are those temporary structures you see at events.
So like extra seating decks?
Yeah, hospitality tents, even media facilities.
Mm-hmm.
They're brought in for the event and then taken down.
So basically pop-up venues within a venue.
They're
But who's responsible for making sure those things are safe?
And this is where it gets interesting. The guide is very clear. The ultimate responsibility still lies with the ground management.
Even though it's temporary.
Even though it's temporary. They can't just wash their hands of it.
Right. They can't just be like, oh, that's the promoter's problem.
Exactly. They need to make sure those structures meet all the same safety standards as the rest of the venue.
Fire resistance, crowd capacity, all that.
All of it. And there have been cases where this has gone wrong.
Oh, really?
Back in 2019, there was a stage collapse at a music festival in Spain. A poorly constructed, demountable stage, and there were injuries.
Wow. So it's a reminder that those temporary structures need to be taken just as seriously as any permanent part of the venue.
Absolutely.
Okay, let's talk about fire safety. I mean, knock on wood, it doesn't happen very often, but
Prevention is key,
of course.
and the guide lays out a whole bunch of fire safety measures. What I find interesting is how they categorize fire risks into these levels.
Oh.
Low, medium, and high. And those levels determine things like the type of fire suppression systems you need,
Right.
the number of exits, even the expected evacuation time for different areas.
So like a high-risk area would have much stricter protocols.
Exactly. Like a kitchen or somewhere with flammable materials.
Versus like an open-air seating section.
Exactly. And they have calculations in there for determining those evacuation times.
Wow. Okay, let's wrap up this part of our deep dive with medical and first aid. And I'm guessing it's a little bit more than just having a first aid kit and some Band-Aids on hand.
It's a whole system.
Yeah.
They have this thing called a medical needs assessment,
Okay.
which basically means they look at everything that could influence the medical planning for an event.
So like what kind of things?
The type of event. Is it a high-energy football match or a more laid-back concert?
Right.
The spectator profile, are you expecting lots of families, young children,
Oh.
older adults, people with medical conditions? They even factor in the national security threat level, which can influence the medical resources they need to have on standby.
So it's all about tailoring the medical response to each event.
Exactly. And that assessment helps them determine things like the number of first aid providers,
Right.
the type of medical equipment they need, and even the setup of a dedicated first aid room.
I'm assuming having a doctor on site is part of the equation too.
For larger events, especially those with those higher risk factors, yeah, they recommend an event doctor.
So someone who's trained to handle emergencies in a crowd.
Exactly. Somebody who can work with those first aid teams.
So a real multi-layered approach. Well, on that reassuring note, I think we're ready to move on to the next part of our deep dive.
That's good. Welcome back.
So we've covered like a lot of ground so far.
Yeah. The S factor,
Seconding,
fire safety.
all the big stuff.
Yeah. So now let's move into the world of communications and control,
Okay.
which might not seem, I don't know, as exciting.
As a last minute goal or yeah, exactly. But it is so crucial for keeping everything running smoothly
Oh, yeah.
and safely because think about it, even if you've got the best planning in the world, if communication breaks down,
Yeah, if you can't.
things can go really bad really fast.
Oh, yeah. Imagine trying to, like, coordinate a response to an incident
In a packed stadium,
with no way to communicate.
yeah, it would be total chaos.
Chaos.
And that's why the guide really stresses having a really well-defined communication plan.
Yeah, and it's not just about having the equipment either.
Right.
It's about establishing those lines of communication.
Yeah. Who talks to who,
Exactly.
when, and how.
Yep. Everyone needs to know their role and who they report to.
So it's kind of like a chain of command, almost like a military operation.
Exactly. And at the heart of all of that is the control point.
Sometimes called the stadium control room.
Or the ground operations center.
It's like the nerve center for the whole venue.
Yeah.
So I'm picturing like a room full of screens, radios, people with headsets.
That's pretty much it. Monitoring everything.
Yeah.
CCTV feeds,
Wow.
radio chatter, weather reports, everything.
And that control point, it's got to be strategically located.
Oh, yeah. Well equipped.
Staffed with people who can think on their feet.
And make quick decisions under pressure.
Sounds like a pretty high pressure job.
It can be, but it's essential.
Yeah.
And the guide goes into a lot of detail about the design of these control points, things like the ergonomics,
Right.
the security, even the acoustics. You want to make sure people in there can hear each other.
Right, even if there's like a roaring crowd outside.
Exactly.
So no blasting AC/DC in the control room during a game?
Probably not the best idea.
Probably not.
No.
And here's something I bet you didn't expect. The guide recommends having a secondary control point.
Yeah, a backup,
Just in case.
just in case something happens to the primary one,
Makes sense. You don't want to lose your ability to communicate.
especially during an emergency.
Yeah, exactly. So you've got your control point, you've got your chain of command, but what about the actual tools that they're using? Like, let's start with radio communication. I mean, that's still a big one, right?
Oh, yeah. It's the workhorse for coordinating staff,
Yeah.
especially those who are on the move. Stewards, security, all of that.
Yeah, because trying to shout instructions across a noisy stadium, that's not going to work.
No. Dedicated radio frequencies are crucial. And everyone needs to be trained on how to use them properly.
Right, and having clear protocols too, like call signs, reporting procedures.
Emergency codes, almost like a secret language.
Yeah, just for safety communication.
Right.
Okay, what about things like internal and external telephone systems? Are those still a thing? Like with everyone having mobile phones these days?
They're still important. Internal phones for communication within the venue, and then external lines to connect to emergency services. And while mobile phones are great, the guide does warn against relying on them solely for emergency communication.
Yeah, because what if the mobile network gets overloaded?
Exactly.
Yeah.
Or disrupted during a big event.
You don't want to be trying to make a crucial call and just getting a busy signal.
Exactly.
Okay, so let's talk about the big one, the PA system.
The voice of the stadium?
The voice of the stadium. I mean, this is not just for announcements and music. This is also crucial for emergency communication, right?
Oh, absolutely. It needs to be loud enough to be heard over the crowd.
Right, and super reliable.
No cutting out in the middle of an evacuation announcement.
Exactly, no. The guide even recommends a backup power supply for the PA system,
Yeah, just in case.
just in case. And here's a cool feature. The PA system should be able to override any other audio sources
Like music or TV broadcasts.
in case of an emergency.
If there's an emergency, boom, that PA system takes over.
It's like the ultimate trump card for getting everyone's attention. And speaking of attention, they also recommend using a distinct signal before an important safety announcement.
Like a siren or a chime,
Something to cut through the noise.
but everyone knows something's coming.
Okay, that's smart, especially if there's a lot of background noise. No, it's not all about audio communication, right? What about visual cues and signage?
Visual communication is super important,
Yeah.
especially in an emergency situation where people might be panicking,
Right.
not paying attention to verbal instructions.
Yeah.
So the guide has a whole section on signs, using pictograms, standardized symbols,
So they're easy to understand.
even for people who don't speak the language.
Right. So clear exit signs, directional arrows, maybe even like maps of the venue.
Exactly. And they even suggest going beyond static signs. They talk about intelligent signs,
What are intelligence signs?
ones that can display dynamic information, real-time updates on crowd flow, directions to less congested exits.
So it's like a GPS for the stadium.
Exactly.
That's cool. Okay, but all of this, the PA system, the signage, all of that, it's only as good as the people who are operating it, right?
Absolutely. The guide really emphasizes the importance of training for all staff involved in these safety operations.
Because it doesn't matter if you have all this fancy equipment if people don't know how to use it.
Exactly. So regular training exercises, drills, simulations, anything to make sure everyone's prepared for a variety of scenarios.
Mhm.
And they even talk about doing post-event debriefs.
Oh, to kind of analyze what went well.
What went well, what could be improved.
Always learning. Okay, and while we're on the topic of everyone being on the same page, what about the spectators themselves? What role do they play in all of this?
They're a crucial part of the safety equation. The guide encourages venues to communicate safety information to spectators in a variety of ways, through signage, PA announcements, even social media.
So it's about educating people, making them aware.
Exactly. The more informed and prepared the spectators are, the smoother things will run, especially in an emergency.
So it's a shared responsibility.
Exactly.
Okay, we've talked a lot about communications, the human element, but what about the stuff that keeps the venue running, like all the mechanical, electrical systems?
Yeah, the behind-the-scenes stuff.
Yeah, it's easy to overlook that, but it's so important.
It's the backbone of the venue.
Mhm.
Lighting, power, elevators, those giant video screens, they all need to be in top shape.
Yeah, because imagine a power outage in the middle of a game.
Not good.
Not good at all. That's why they really stress regular maintenance for all those systems.
Oh, yeah. Qualified electricians on staff, regular inspections, clear procedures for dealing with malfunctions.
And I'm guessing backup power is a must-have.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Especially for those critical systems.
Emergency lighting, communication systems, medical equipment.
Everything you need to keep running if the power goes out.
You've got to be prepared for anything. And the guide even gets into some really specific safety features for different installations.
Yeah, like lightning protection systems.
To make sure a power surge doesn't fry all your equipment.
Exactly. And making sure cables are protected.
To prevent damage, trip hazards, all of that.
All of that. Safety first.
What about those giant video screens? Those seem like they could be a hazard if they weren't properly installed.
Oh, yeah. The guide has a whole section on those.
Really?
They need to be securely mounted,
Of course.
regularly inspected. And the content displayed needs to be appropriate, not inciting any trouble.
So no showing controversial replays that might get the crowd all riled up.
Exactly. It's about using common sense.
Keeping the focus on safety.
Exactly.
Okay, so we've covered the inside of the venue pretty thoroughly.
Yeah.
What about the area outside?
Just Zone X.
Parking lots, public transport hubs, pedestrian walkways.
Zone X. Often overlooked.
Yeah, but it's a big part of the safety picture, right?
Absolutely. Because you don't want traffic jams or overcrowded sidewalks creating a hazard before people even get to the venue.
Exactly. So that's why they recommend kind of a coordinated approach to managing Zone X.
Yeah, involving the venue, the local authorities, transportation providers.
So everyone working together, what kind of things do they need to consider?
Traffic flow, parking, public transport schedules, pedestrian routes. Clear signage is essential, and they talk about using PA announcements and social media to give real-time updates.
On traffic conditions.
Delays, anything like that. Keep people informed.
Help them make good decisions. And I'm guessing security is a big concern in Zone X as well.
Big concern. Large crowds gathering outside can be a target.
For crime, terrorism, yeah.
So they recommend a robust security plan for Zone X,
Crowd control measures.
surveillance,
YAG checks, maybe even.
potentially. It's about extending that safety perimeter beyond the walls of the venue.
Makes sense. And what about accessibility for people with disabilities?
Another crucial consideration. Accessible parking, drop-off zones, pedestrian routes that are easy to navigate, and they encourage working with transportation providers to make sure those buses and trains are accessible.
Right, so everyone, regardless of their abilities, can have a good experience.
A safe and enjoyable experience.
Okay, last but not least, we've got to talk about media presence at these events.
Yeah, big part of covering these events. But their presence needs to be managed carefully.
Because you don't want a bunch of photographers blocking an exit.
Or a TV crew getting in the way of emergency responders.
Exactly. So the guide really stresses coordination between the venue and the media.
They need to work together to establish those guidelines.
Through media access, movement, all of that.
Designated areas for photographers.
Right.
Clear protocols for camera crews.
Yeah, so everyone knows what they're supposed to be doing. And the guide also talks about the safety of the media personnel themselves.
Yeah, they need to be aware of the protocols, have access to safety gear, be briefed on emergency procedures.
Because they're part of the crowd, too, just like anyone else.
Exactly. And when it comes to things like camera platforms, gantries, all of that, it needs to be secure, inspected, maintained.
You don't want a camera rig falling on somebody.
Exactly. Safety first.
Always. Always. And it sounds like that's a pretty good segue into the final part of our deep dive.
Emergency planning and preparedness.
We've talked a lot about preventing things from going wrong.
But now we get to the what-ifs.
What happens when they do go wrong?
How do venues respond effectively?
Exactly. All right, so we're back, and for this final part of our deep dive, we're going to get into, like, the real nitty-gritty. You know, we've talked about preventing incidents, but now let's face it, sometimes things just go wrong.
Right, that's where emergency planning comes in.
Yeah, emergency planning, not the most fun part of the job, but definitely crucial.
Absolutely. And the guide makes it clear this isn't just reacting after something happens. It's about anticipating the risks, being proactive, and having a plan for anything.
So I mean, are we talking everything here? From like a minor slip and fall to, well,
Everything. Fire, crowd disorder, weather events, medical emergencies, security threats, even terrorism. They've thought of it all. And the first step is that risk assessment, looking at the venue, the type of event, the crowd you're expecting, even things like the local climate.
So you're like looking for all the possible hazards, but on a huge scale.
Exactly. And once you've identified those risks, you develop specific plans for each type of emergency. And these plans, they need to be detailed.
So you'd have like a fire evacuation plan, a crowd surge plan, a severe weather plan, and all of those are tailored to that specific venue and event.
Exactly. But here's the thing. Those plans can't just sit in a drawer. They need to be tested.
Yeah, you don't want to find out there's a flaw in your evacuation plan when there's a real fire.
Exactly. So you run drills, exercises, you walk through the plan, you make sure everyone knows what to do, and you improve communication and coordination between all the teams.
And I'm guessing those teams, we're not just talking venue staff here.
Oh, no. You've got to involve external stakeholders, local authorities, emergency services, even neighboring businesses sometimes. It's a real team effort.
Makes sense. You want the fire department to know your layout before they have to come in and, put out a fire.
Okay, so you've got your plans, you've practiced them, but what about the communication during an actual emergency? Communication is key in any crisis. The guide really stresses having redundant systems.
So that means like radios, internal phones, external lines, the PA system, and everyone knows how to use them.
Right. If one system goes down, you've got backup. You don't want to be left in the dark when every second counts. And when it comes to communicating with the crowd, the messages need to be clear and concise.
So no technical jargon, no confusing instructions.
None of that. The goal is to get people to safety quickly and calmly. So the messages have to be simple, direct, and easy to understand. And that's where crowd management comes in.
Right, because if everybody panics and tries to get out at the same time, that's when things can get really dangerous.
Exactly. So you need those designated evacuation routes, clear signage to guide people, and trained stewards who can keep things moving and maintain order. It's not just about getting people out, it's about getting them out safely.
In a controlled way. And they're even using technology to help with this now, right? Like that crowd simulation modeling.
Oh yeah, you can use that to predict how people will behave during evacuation, identify potential bottlenecks, places where people might get stuck, and adjust your plans accordingly.
So you can kind of stay one step ahead of the crowd. And of course, you need to be ready to provide first aid and medical care if there are injuries.
Absolutely. Dedicated first aid room, trained providers, and a system for contacting emergency medical services.
So like a little mini emergency room right there in the venue. Okay, so we've covered a lot, but what about after the emergency? What happens then?
That's what the guide calls post-emergency procedures. It's all about learning from the experience. You debrief the staff, review how the response went, see if there's anything you need to improve. It's a continuous cycle. Plan, test, respond, learn.
Always striving to do better next time.
Exactly. And I think that's really the main point here. Safety at sports grounds, it's not just checking boxes. It's an ongoing commitment to improvement, learning from mistakes, and working together, everyone involved. The management, the staff, the spectators, even the media.
Yeah, it really is a team effort. And I think you put it perfectly. It's like a giant puzzle where all the pieces have to fit just right to make sure everyone has a safe and enjoyable time.
Couldn't have said it better myself.
Well, I think that about wraps it up for our deep dive into safety at sports grounds. Hopefully you found it informative, and until next time, stay safe out there.